All right, so what's going on? Today's video is going to be very theoretical. And what do I mean by theoretical? I mean that these are concepts that technically exist in the game, but there's no real way of measuring it. We're going to talk about compounds, when to use compound techniques, when not to use compound techniques. But to do so, we have to understand some other concepts that require some math. So you can either take my word for it or pause the video, get a calculator, get a pen, get a paper, and start jotting down some notes. But really, you can take my word for it. It's not too crazy. But at the end of the day, compound techniques can be your friend. Compound techniques can be your enemy. Now, why is this? Well, compound techniques are interesting for a couple of reasons. One, from a DPS standpoint, they are very powerful. Two, they do element down accumulation for their respective elements. Because of that, they kind of play in two different worlds, and you have to be careful and understand what they're really designed for. So, while they are high DPS, they really aren't a high damaging move. And I know that sounds confusing because when you look at the potency, you're like, this is pretty powerful. And this is where we're going to get into a couple of concepts that revolve around crit and how you have to be very wary of what these compound techniques are doing compared to other options that you have, specifically for Techter. And then of course, the other thing is element down accumulation. Quick overview of how element down accumulation works. Again, of course, I did a video way back when. I'll link that in the top right corner. But essentially, element down accumulation only works when one, your enemy or the boss is active, and two, a physical down. So we're going to use Baranstian or ice as our example. If you freeze an enemy or a boss and you do Baranstian, you are no longer doing element accumulation. All of that element accumulation is wasted. The only thing that you are doing now is damage. So at a very high level, you don't want to use compound technique of that matching element when the enemy is in that element down state. There are some exceptions that we'll get into a little bit, but at a high level. So really, we want to talk about the damage, because I know a lot of you out there are using compound techniques for damage, which means you are most likely mistiming your compound techniques and you're mismanaging your down accumulation and resource. Let's step away from compound techniques and let's look at the math, the theoretical concepts behind why this is a problem and why something like Encore Swift Smash should be a suitable replacement. Let's start focusing on critical attacks. In the game, right now, we have two things that technically we can measure to some degree, or at least take Sega's word for it, which is critical hit chance or crit rate. So if you hear me say crit rate, I'm saying critical hit chance. And of course, critical hit damage. What is critical hit chance? That is the chance in which you will land a critical hit. For the examples that I'm going to be discussing today, I'm going to set it at 50%. Now, granted, depending on your weapon now, you could have 50%, you could have less, but it just makes the math easier from a theoretical standpoint. And of course, it's all theoretical, and even with 50% crit, you might crit less than 50%, you might crit more than 50%. It's just a chance. And then of course, we have critical hit damage, which is after landing a critical strike, you do an additional X percentage of damage. For most people, that's probably going to be close to 32% or 132%. But if you're walking around with a fixed determinant of 5, that critical hit damage is going to be 52% or 152%. Now, we really don't have to worry about crit damage for these examples, but we're just laying out the basics to where we get into things that we technically can't measure, but do exist in that theoretical abstract space. What are those? The first one is what I call critical opportunity or crit hit opportunity. Now, what is crit hit opportunity? This is the opportunities that you have to crit. Now, why is this important? We have to think about frames. This is where frames become very, very important. And many of you have heard me say that you have to be careful of frame data and on-paper DPS, because crit opportunity starts to make things a little wonky. Let me give you an example. We're going to use compound technique full Melgian, and we're going to use Swift Smash. We're not going to worry about Encore Swift Smash. We'll account for that later. Swift Smash is, Charged Swift Smash specifically, is 130 frames. Fomelgian is 248 frames. Now, of course, I'm going to be bending the math a little bit, but essentially, you can land effectively 2 Swift Smashes before you complete 1 Fomelgian. And of course, I know that the math doesn't completely add up. We're about 12 frames off, but essentially that. And so you have twice as many times to crit with Swift Smash than you do Fomelgian. This is very, very important because, as you know, Fomelgian is 1800 potency. And I think its DPS is around 438 or something when you divide that by 248. At a 50% crit rate, you have a 1 in 2 chance or 50-50 chance that Fomelgian will crit. So either you do 1800 with variance, so of course you're not always going to get that 1800 because our variance or our floor potency is so high, or if you crit at a crit rate or a crit damage rate of 132%, you get close to 2400. A little bit less, but I'm just rounding for simplicity. But now you look at Swift Smash and you're like, okay, just looking at Swift Smash alone, we won't take into account Photonic Fury, we won't take into account Encore Swift Smash. We're just doing that base hit, that 1 hit. You have 2 times to crit. So the chances of you critting are more likely. And so if you look at that, the potency could be fairly equal. Or potentially Swift Smash is better. Why? Well, because you have more crit opportunity. So let's say you get lucky and you crit with both Swift Smashes. Well, now you're doing more damage than a non-crit Fomelgian. You're also not burning valuable resources of your compound techniques that you could be using later. And that's really the most important thing to remember, especially if you're fighting an enemy that's weak to ice. Saving Baranstian for those critical moments can be very, very important versus rolling the dice on Fomelgian. While it does a lot of damage and can crit, in that situation would beat Swift Smash. If it doesn't crit and you get a low roll, not only do you do a lot of low damage, but now you've burned a valuable resource that you could have used otherwise. So that is crit opportunity. Now I use Fomelgian, which makes things a little tricky because our other concept, which is critical hit variance. Now you might be asking, well, crit doesn't vary. And you are correct. Every individual attack does not vary. So if you crit on a single attack, that attack does that 32%, or if you're running Termina, upwards to 52% additional crit damage. Fomelgian and Swift Smash, when we ignore Encore Jump and we ignore Photonic Fury, are single hit attacks, which means that if you were to crit on that attack, you get all of that crit damage. But now let's look at compounds such as Zandian. Let's look at compounds such as Baranstian. Zandian hits 8 times. Baranstian hits 17 times. So this is where we have to be careful with potency. This is where we have to be careful with DPS. Because while, yes, Baranstian is what? 1760 potency and Zandian is 1600 potency, and of course Zandian has the most DPS. That potency is divided by 8 for Zandian and 17 hits for Baranstian. And of course, each of these hits are not equally distributed. So this is where we have to be careful of looking at DPS and really understanding crit variance. Once again, we'll take Zandian because Zandian's a simple math because there's 8 hits. So I can divide that by 2 because once again, we're at a 50% crit rate. For you will never get, at 50%, you will never get the full crit damage for Zandian. Unless probability, which is fairly improbable but possible, you crit on every hit of Zandian. And so let's look at the worst case and the best case scenario for Zandian, critting at 50%. If you were to crit on the last hit of Zandian and 3 of the other hits, which fortunately are equally distributed, your potency goes from 1600 to 1920, which is a potency increase of 20%. So even in the best case scenario at a 50% crit rate, if you crit on the last hit and the 3 other hits, you're not getting 32%, you're getting 20%. And of course, I'm skipping through some things because I'm not accounting for variance. In these examples, I'm controlling for variance. So you can imagine those other hits that aren't critting aren't also doing maximum damage. But for simplicity, for math's sake, for this example, we're just going to, in the worst case scenario, If you were to not essentially crit the last hit and you just critted 4 of the little hits, your potency goes from 1600 to 1792, which is an increase in potency of 12%, 20% less than your 32% crit damage. And so while yes, something like Swift Smash from a DPS standpoint technically can't outcompete it on raw numbers, it does have more opportunities to crit because even though Zandian is 196 frames, you only get 1 shot versus with Swift Smash, you have more opportunities. So while in ideal situations, Swift Smash might not always outcompete, it gives you more options. It allows you to save resources, and in many cases, it can outperform, or in other cases, the DPS is not as big of a loss given what you can do further down the road. How does this go back to our compound technique usage? And we talked about this a little bit at the beginning of the video. For Techter, I believe in solo environments, you really don't need to use off-element compound techniques. So if you're fighting an enemy weak to ice, you only need Baranstian. Zandian and Fomelgion, in those situations where you don't want to use Baranstian, such as you've already frozen the enemy, feels like you can get away with Swift Smash because you start taking advantage of the critical chance opportunities. You start trying to control for the fact that you could get a low roll, low variance on those other compound techniques, which is a big detriment. Not saying that you won't get a low roll on Swift Smash, but it's less of a risk because then you still have that compound gauge to use otherwise when they do get physically damaged. Because then you can use Baranstian and you can start pushing your element accumulation faster because once again, element scaling is the enemy of Techter. Now, of course, there are situations to where you can and probably should use off-element compound. And that is likely when you get used to timing, especially when you're doing purple triggers, when you know the rotations, when you know how things are going to play out. You don't want to be sitting on 2 stocks too long. So that might be one of the situations where, okay, I can use an off-element compound, I can roll the dice, because if I don't, now I'm just sitting on 2 bars. How much theoretical damage am I losing because I haven't used that? Can I use that and then I can rebuild that bar before I'm going to need it for the next round? So those are things you're going to have to get used to and play around with. But outside of those situations, I think really for Techter, especially when we start thinking about element stance switching, that's the last video we just discussed, in addition to things like Encore Swift Smash, crit rate, crit opportunity, crit variance, it sounds like the best thing that we can do is essentially save those resources for when they matter. Now for Force, different situation because they don't have Swift Smash. Looking at crit opportunity, looking at crit variance, Jet Intensity also falls under this purview. Jet Intensity is for those who might not be familiar, is the jet boot attack where you hold the normal attack and then it does 15 hits, that 15th hit being the big damage. But once again, you have to crit on that final hit. I think the entire potency of Jet Intensity is 3,550. That final 15th hit is 2,500 potency. So the other 14 hits take that 1,050 potency and divide it by 14. So if you've got a critical hit chance of 50% and you do not crit on the final hit, well, you can kind of see where your crit variance is going to be. You're also going to see where your floor potency is going to do. In addition, the entire Jet Intensity attack takes 480 frames. So you have one, and during a downstate, because downstates are usually what, 8 to 10 seconds. So during one Jet Intensity, you have one opportunity to crit on that final hit for 2,500 potency. Versus Swift Smash, if we do 480 divided by 130, the math comes out to 3.7. We can round that up a little bit. So you have 4 opportunities to do Swift Smash, Encore Jump plus Photonic Fury, in addition to the fact that your wand has the 10% main class bonus. So whatever that damage is, times it by 10%, and then multiply that by 4. The variance is going to be lower because Swift Smash only has 2 hits. If you count Swift Smash Photonic Fury, we'll ignore Encore Jump. And so you have 4 times to crit across 2 hits, that main hit being 710 potency, versus 1 time to crit on that big giant attack while running the risk that you crit on those smaller other 14 hits. And so this is highly theoretical because there's no way to measure that technically, but something to think about when it comes to resource conservation, to really understand where your damage is coming from, the things that can impact your damage, and the best ways to kind of control those factors to the best of your ability. Of course, we can't control RNG, but we can soften the blow when it deals us a bad hand. So I know this was theoretical. I know it's something that might not play out in a run. It might play out fairly well in a run, and it might just average out. But really, this is something to think about, especially if you start noticing that, don't seem like I'm improving or getting where I need. Start thinking about how you're using your compounds and the damage that you might be doing. Fortunately, and one of the things that kind of tipped me off was that now we have health bars. And so you can kind of see that over time when you're using Zandian, and it's like, man, this didn't really do anything to the enemy's health bar, versus Swift Smash that could be more noticeable because of things like crit opportunity and crit hit variant. But other than that, let me know what you think in the comments. Of course, questions, feel free to ask. And I'm going to leave you with a demonstration of what we talked about. And really what I want you to focus on is what I'm using during downs, how I'm managing my compounds, but more importantly, look at the clear times. And I'll catch you all next time.